Everyone ignored the maid's toddler girl. Until the billionaire called her on stage, the ballroom was still clapping when Daniel Hartley stopped talking. He was 3 sentences into his closing line, the one about gratitude and second chances, the one his assistant had printed in bold on the teleprompter card. 300 guests sat under gold chandeliers, waiting for him to finish. He never did. His eyes had locked onto something at the edge of the dance floor. A little girl in a yellow dress. Maybe 3 years old. She stood very still, the way children do when a room is too big and too loud for them. She was holding a stuffed rabbit. Daniel's hand tightened around the microphone. He knew that rabbit. He knew the small brown patch stitched crookedly over its left ear, the fur worn thin in the exact same spot, the exact same way. He had watched someone sew that patch on with clumsy, careful stitches. He had watched it get tucked under someone's arm every single night for years. That rabbit had been buried in the ground 10 years ago. With his sister. "Sir." The event coordinator's voice crackled faintly through his earpiece. "Everything okay?" Daniel didn't answer her. He set the microphone down on the podium, stepped off the small stage, and walked straight through the crowd of tuxedos and diamond earrings toward a child nobody in that room had bothered to notice until now. Somewhere behind him, a woman in a plain black uniform went pale and started pushing forward, whispering, "Mia, Mia, honey, come here." But Daniel got there first. He knelt down slowly, so he wouldn't tower over her, and looked at the rabbit in her small arms like it might vanish if he blinked. "Where did you get that?" he asked, so quietly only she could hear. The girl looked up at him with wide, serious eyes. "It was my daddy's," she said. "He gave it to me before he went to heaven." Daniel's chest went tight. 300 guests were watching a billionaire kneel on a marble floor in front of a maid's daughter, and not one of them understood what they were witnessing. But Daniel understood one thing with total certainty. That rabbit had no business in this little girl's arms. Unless someone, for 10 years, had been lying to him about how his sister really died. The ballroom held its breath. Nobody moved. Waiters froze mid-step with trays balanced on their palms. A photographer lowered her camera, unsure if she was even allowed to raise it again. Daniel Hartley had built an empire out of composure. He never lost his temper in board meetings. He never let cameras catch him off guard. Tonight, in front of every major donor in the city, he was kneeling on the floor of his own hotel, and his hands were shaking. "What's your name?" he asked the little girl. "Mia," she said. "That's a pretty name." His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Can I see your rabbit for a second?" Mia hugged it tighter instead. A woman reached them then, breathless, her name tag still pinned crookedly to her black uniform vest. Elena Reyes. Housekeeping. She looked mortified, the particular kind of fear that came from years of being told not to be seen and definitely not to be heard. "Mr. Hartley, I am so sorry," she said. She wandered off. "She's never done that before." I turned around for 1 second. "She's fine." Daniel stood up, and something in his face made Elena stop apologizing. "I'm not upset. I just need to ask you something." Elena's arms wrapped instinctively around her daughter's shoulders. "That rabbit," Daniel said. "Where did it come from?" "It's just an old toy, sir. I can throw it out if it's a problem." "No." The word came out too fast, too sharp. He softened it. "No. Please don't. I just need to know where you got it." Elena glanced down at Mia, then back at him, clearly trying to read whether she was in trouble. "It was my husband's," she said carefully. "He gave it to her before he passed. It's the only thing of his she has left." Daniel's jaw tightened. 300 guests were still watching. Somewhere near the bar, a man in a tuxedo whispered something to his wife, and she shushed him. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Daniel asked. He led them past the kitchen, past the coat check, into a small side office usually reserved for event staff. It smelled like coffee and printer ink. Elena sat stiffly on the edge of a folding chair, Mia on her lap, the rabbit still clutched against her chest like a shield. Daniel didn't sit. He paced once, then stopped in front of the window. "I'm sorry if I scared you out there," he said. "That wasn't my intention." "You didn't scare me," Elena said, which was a lie, and they both seemed to know it. "You scared me a little." A small, unexpected laugh escaped him. It surprised them both. "Fair," he said. He turned back around and looked at Mia, who was watching him with the unblinking curiosity only small children manage. "Can I ask you something, Mia?" She nodded. "Your daddy," Daniel said gently. "Did he ever tell you where he grew up? Where he was a little boy?" Mia thought about this with great seriousness, the way children consider questions that feel important even when they don't understand why. "He said he used to live somewhere with a really big garden," she said. "With flowers everywhere. And a fountain that made noise like rain." Elena went very still. Daniel felt something cold move down the back of his neck. He knew that fountain. It sat in the east garden of his family's estate, the one his mother had redesigned twice and still complained about. It had made that exact sound, like rain, like static, for as long as he could remember. He used to fall asleep to it as a boy, on nights when it was hot enough to leave the windows open. "Elena," he said slowly, "what was your husband's name?" "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Reyes." The name meant nothing to him. And that, somehow, was worse than if it had. "I don't know anyone named Thomas," Daniel admitted. "But I know that rabbit. I've known it since I was 8 years old." Elena's arms tightened around Mia. "That's not possible," she said, though her voice had lost its certainty. "It was my sister's," Daniel said. "Clara's. She named it Buttons because of the button eye that never matched the other one. She stitched that patch onto its ear herself when she was 6, because she chewed a hole in it and didn't want our mother to find out." The room went silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning. "Clara died when she was 7 years old," Daniel continued. "That rabbit was buried with her. I watched them close the casket around it myself." Elena's face drained of color so completely that for a moment Daniel thought she might faint. She pulled Mia closer, almost defensively, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. "You're wrong," she finally whispered. "You have to be wrong." "I'm not." Daniel crouched down so he was eye level with her again. "So please, help me understand. How does a toy that was buried in the ground 10 years ago end up in your daughter's arms tonight?" Elena looked down at Mia, who had gone quiet, sensing without understanding that something important was happening around her. Then she looked back up at Daniel, and for the first time, he saw something underneath the fear on her face. "Guilt. I need to tell you something," Elena said. "Something I promised myself I would never tell anyone." She glanced at the closed door behind him, as if checking they were truly alone. "But if you're right about that rabbit," she whispered, "then everything I've believed about my husband, everything I built our life around, might be a lie too." Daniel didn't take her back into the ballroom. He took her upstairs, to the executive floor, to an office with dark wood shelves and a window that looked out over the city instead of the garden he was trying not to think about. Elena sat with Mia on her lap again, the rabbit now between them like something that needed protecting from both sides. "Take your time," Daniel said, though his own hands weren't steady. Elena nodded, gathering herself. "Thomas grew up on your family's estate," she said finally. "Not visiting. Living there. His mother worked for your household. She was staff, like me. He grew up on the grounds." Daniel felt the words land somewhere behind his ribs. "That's not possible," he said. "I would remember a boy living on our property. I would remember growing up with him." "Would you?" Elena asked, and there was no accusation in it, only a quiet, tired kind of honesty. "You were a child too. Children don't always remember the way adults think they will." Daniel opened his laptop, more to have something to do with his hands than out of real hope. What was his mother's name? Carmen. Carmen Reyes. He typed it into the old staff archive, the one that went back 3 decades, the one his family's HR department had never bothered to digitize properly. The search bar blinked at him. No results found. He tried Thomas Reyes. Nothing. He tried the estate's groundskeeping logs, the household payroll records, even old holiday party photo archives from the years he guessed Thomas would have been a boy. Nothing. Not a name, not a photo, not a single line. There's no record of them, Daniel said slowly. Not even a payroll entry. It's like they were never there. Elena's jaw tightened. Thomas used to say the same thing. That it was like his whole childhood got erased the day his mother stopped working for your family. When was that? 10 years ago, Elena said quietly. The same year, he told me once, that a little girl on the estate died. The room went cold. Daniel sat back slowly. You're telling me his mother left the same year Clara died? I'm telling you what he told me, Elena said. He never gave me details. He said it was too painful. I didn't push him. I thought it was grief. I didn't know it might be. She stopped herself. Might be what? Daniel asked. I don't know, Elena admitted. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Daniel closed the laptop. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mia had grown sleepy against her mother's shoulder, one small hand still curled around the rabbit's frayed ear. And then, without meaning to, without even realizing he was doing it, Daniel felt something shift loose in his memory. A door that had been shut for 10 years, cracking open just slightly. The East Garden. Summer. The fountain hissing like static behind them. Clara is 6, chasing a ball across the grass, laughing so hard she can barely run straight. There's a boy with her. 10 years old, maybe 11. Quiet, careful, always glancing over his shoulder before he laughs too loud. He catches the ball before it rolls into the hedges and tosses it back to her gently, like he's used to being careful with things that aren't his. Daniel, 8 years old, watches from the stone steps. Who's that? He asks his nanny. That's Thomas, she says. Don't mention him to your mother. Daniel blinked, and the memory was gone as fast as it came, leaving only a strange, hollow ache behind his eyes. I think I remember him, he said quietly. A boy. Playing with Clara. I was told not to mention him to my mother. Elena stared at him. Why would anyone tell you that? I don't know, Daniel admitted. I was 8. I didn't ask questions like that back then. There was a soft knock at the door before either of them could say anything else. Margaret Hartley stepped inside without waiting for an answer, the way she always did, dressed in pale blue silk that had probably cost more than most people's cars. She stopped the moment she saw Elena and Mia on the small office sofa. Daniel, what is going on? You walked off the stage in the middle of your own speech. The Whitfields asking questions, the press is. Her eyes landed on the rabbit in Mia's arms. Daniel watched his mother's face carefully, the way he'd learned to watch it his whole life, reading the smallest shifts beneath her practiced calm. For half a second, something flickered there. Recognition. Fear. Gone almost before it appeared. Mother, Daniel said slowly. Do you remember a boy named Thomas? He would have grown up on the estate. His mother worked for us. Carmen. The color left Margaret's face so quickly it was almost startling. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, too fast, too smooth. Why would you ask me that? Tonight, of all nights. Because his son gave this rabbit to his daughter, Daniel said, gesturing gently toward Mia. And it's Clara's. The one buried with her. Margaret's hand rose to her throat, fingers pressing lightly against her pearl necklace, a gesture Daniel had seen 1,000 times when she was trying to compose herself in front of donors. That's absurd, she said. There must be some mistake. Toys get sold, get donated, get passed around. It doesn't mean anything. Mother. I have guests waiting downstairs, Margaret said, cutting him off. We are not doing this tonight. She turned toward Elena, and her expression shifted into something colder, more practiced. You're the housekeeping supervisor for the catering contractor, correct? Elena straightened, instinctively protective. Yes, I hope this evening's disruption won't happen again, Margaret said, and though her tone stayed pleasant, there was something underneath it that made Elena's stomach twist. Then Margaret was gone, the door clicking shut softly behind her, leaving a silence that felt heavier than before. Daniel let out a breath. I'm sorry about that. She's not usually like this. It's fine, Elena said, though her voice had gone tight. I should get Mia home. It's late. Of course. Daniel stood, walked her to the door, and hesitated. Elena, thank you. For telling me the truth, even though you didn't have to. She managed a small, uncertain smile and left with Mia asleep against her shoulder, the rabbit tucked safely between them. The call came the next morning. Elena was making Mia breakfast in the small apartment provided through her staff contract when her phone buzzed. It was the catering company's HR office. Ms. Reyes, we're calling to inform you that your contract with the Hartley Grand Hotel Group has been terminated, effective immediately. Elena's spoon stopped halfway to the bowl. Terminated? I don't understand. I have a review scheduled for next month. I've never had a single complaint. I'm sorry, this decision came directly from ownership. You'll need to vacate the staff housing unit within 24 hours. The line went dead before Elena could ask another question. She stood frozen in her small kitchen, Mia humming quietly at the table behind her, still clutching the rabbit even in daylight. Someone powerful had moved fast. Faster than grief. Faster than curiosity. Someone wanted her gone before she could say another word. Elena stared at the phone in her hand for a long moment after the call ended, as if staring at it might make the words rearrange themselves into something less frightening. Mama. Mia's small voice pulled her back. Is something wrong? No, baby. Elena forced a smile, the kind mothers learn to manufacture on command. Finish your breakfast. She dialed Daniel's number with shaking hands. She'd saved it the night before, half out of politeness, half because some instinct told her she might need it. He picked up on the second ring. Elena, is everything okay? I was fired this morning, she said, keeping her voice low so Mia wouldn't hear the tremor in it. Effective immediately. They're giving me 24 hours to leave the staff housing. Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, give me an hour. Daniel found his mother in the estate's morning room, sunlight spilling across her breakfast table, a stack of foundation paperwork untouched beside her coffee. You fired her, he said. No greeting, no preamble. Margaret didn't look up from her tablet. I don't involve myself in catering contractor personnel decisions. Don't do that. Don't pretend you're above the details when you've never once been above the details in your life. Margaret set the tablet down slowly. Daniel, I don't know what you think happened last night, but a stranger's child holding an old toy is not the beginning of some grand mystery. It's a coincidence. Then why did you flag her contract within an hour of leaving that office? For a moment, something almost cracked in his mother's composed expression. Almost. I did what was necessary to avoid a scandal, she said. You made a scene in front of 300 guests, Daniel. The story could have gone anywhere. I contained it. By destroying a widow's income and putting her 3-year-old out of a home. Margaret's mouth tightened. She'll find other work. Daniel stared at his mother, feeling something he rarely felt in her presence. Not frustration, not the usual friction of two strong-willed people who loved each other imperfectly, but something closer to suspicion. I'm reinstating her position, he said. Today. And I'm giving her a permanent staff apartment, not a contractor unit. Daniel. This isn't a discussion, he said, and walked out before she could argue further. By that afternoon, Elena had her job back, better than before, in fact, transferred directly onto the hotel's own payroll instead of the contracting agency's, with a small apartment in the staff residence building that didn't come with a 90-day lease shadow hanging over it. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt like she'd stepped onto ice that hadn't finished freezing. You didn't have to do all this, she told Daniel, standing in the doorway of the new apartment while Mia explored the unfamiliar rooms, dragging the rabbit along the hallway floor behind her. I did, Daniel said simply. None of this is your fault. If anyone owes anyone something here, it's my family that owes yours. Elena studied him for a moment, the tired lines around his eyes, the careful way he chose his words, like a man trying not to disturb something fragile. Can I show you something? She asked. She led him to a small box she'd carried from her old unit, one she hadn't unpacked yet. Inside, beneath folded baby clothes Mia had long outgrown, was a worn envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed but never opened. I found this in Thomas's things after he passed, Elena said. It's addressed to someone named Daniel. I always assumed it was a mistake, a common name, a coincidence. I never had the heart to open something that wasn't mine to read. Daniel took the envelope carefully, like it might dissolve in his hands. His own name was written across the front in handwriting he didn't recognize, careful and slightly uneven, like someone who had rewritten it more than once to get it right. May I? He asked. Elena nodded. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single page, the ink faded but legible. Daniel, if you ever read this, I want you to know none of it was your fault. I never blamed you. I never blamed Clara. What happened wasn't a child's fault. I hope someday you know the whole truth, even if it isn't mine to tell you. Thomas. Daniel read it twice. Then a third time. He knew, Daniel said quietly. Whatever happened to Clara? He knew something. That evening, Daniel drove out to the estate's old groundskeeper's cottage at the edge of the property. A small stone building that had sat empty for years, though the current groundskeeper, an older man named Walt who'd worked the grounds for over 30 years, still used the shed beside it for equipment. Walt looked up from oiling a set of head shears when Daniel's car pulled up the gravel drive. Mr. Hartley, he said, surprised. Don't get many visits out this far. I need to ask you about someone, Daniel said. Thomas Reyes. His mother, Carmen. They lived on the estate when I was a boy. Walt's hand stilled on the shears. Been a long time since anyone said that name to me, he said finally. So they existed. I'm not imagining it. Course they existed. Carmen worked the East Wing for near 15 years. Thomas grew up right alongside you and your sister. Practically. Good boy. Quiet. Careful. What happened to them? Walt set the shears down and looked out toward the estate's main house, visible through the trees in the fading light. You really don't know, he said, more to himself than to Daniel. They never told you. Told me what? Walt was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that comes from a man deciding whether 10 years of silence is worth breaking. The day your sister died, he said finally, the back gate by the pond was supposed to be locked. Always was, every day, rain or shine, ever since your father had that pond dug. Standing order. I know that. It's still locked every day. It wasn't locked that day, Walt said. Your mother had it opened that morning. Wanted the caterers to bring the photography equipment through the back for some magazine shoot she had planned by the roses. Told me herself to leave it open till noon. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. Clara drowned in that pond, he said slowly. She did, Walt said. And Thomas was the one who pulled her out. 12 years old, couldn't swim well himself, jumped in anyway. Too late by then. But he tried. Nobody ever gave that boy credit for trying. Why wasn't this in any report? Any investigation? Walt's face hardened. Because your mother made sure it wasn't. Told the insurance people the gate malfunctioned. Told the police the same. I know because she told me what to say if anyone asked, and I said it, because I had 4 kids of my own to feed and no other work waiting for me if I didn't. Daniel felt sick. And Carmen. Thomas. Let go within the month. Quietly. Given a settlement, I heard, on the condition they never spoke about that day again. Far as I know, they never did. Daniel drove back to the main house in silence, Walt's words circling in his head like something he couldn't outrun. He found his mother in the study, and this time he didn't knock. "You locked me out of nothing," he said. "I remember. I actually remember standing at that gate. Clara ran through it. It was open." Margaret didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her face had lost all its practiced calm. "You don't understand what that day was like," she said. "The stress. The event. I made one decision. You let a 7-year-old girl near an unlocked pond gate for a photo shoot," Daniel said, his voice breaking despite himself. "And then you spent 10 years letting me believe it was some tragic accident nobody could have prevented." "I have spent 10 years living with what I did," Margaret said, her voice suddenly raw in a way Daniel had never heard from her. "Don't you dare think I haven't." "Then why hide it? Why erase Thomas and his mother from every record like they never existed?" Margaret's composure cracked fully now, tears rising despite her visible effort to stop them. "Because if the truth ever came out, it wouldn't just destroy me. It would destroy this family's name, the foundation, everything your father built, everything you've built since. I told myself I was protecting all of it. Protecting you. By erasing the boy who tried to save her." Margaret said nothing. "Elena needs to hear this from you," Daniel said. "Not from me. From you." "No." Margaret's voice sharpened instantly, fear replacing grief. "Absolutely not. If that woman goes to the press with any part of this." "She won't. You don't know that." Margaret stood, suddenly cold again, suddenly herself. "I will not let a housekeeper unravel everything this family has built because of an old accident that cannot be undone. If she pushes this any further, I will make sure she never works in this industry again. I have the connections to make that happen, Daniel, and you know I do." Daniel stared at his mother, the woman who had raised him, the woman who had just threatened a widow and her 3-year-old daughter to protect a decade-old lie. "So that's it," he said quietly. "That's who you really are." "That's who I have to be," Margaret said. "Someone has to protect this family. Even from itself." Daniel walked out without another word, his phone already in his hand, Elena's number pulled up on the screen. But as he stood in the hallway, his thumb hovering over the call button, a terrible question settled over him like a weight he couldn't set down. If he told Elena the whole truth now, his mother's role in Clara's death, the cover-up, all of it, he would be handing her something that could destroy his family completely. But if he stayed silent to protect them, he would become exactly the kind of person his mother already was. There was no version of tonight where he walked away clean. Daniel didn't call. He drove. Some decisions were too large for a phone screen. He needed to see Elena's face when he told her, needed her to know this wasn't something he was hiding behind distance. He found her in the new apartment, sitting on the floor with Mia, sorting through a box of old photographs by lamplight. Mia looked up first, offering him a small, sleepy wave before returning to the photo in her hands. "Daniel." Elena rose slowly, reading something in his expression before he'd said a word. "What happened?" "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to know that whatever you decide to do after I tell you, I won't stop you. I won't threaten you. I won't do what my mother's doing." Elena's arms crossed instinctively, bracing. "What is your mother doing?" Daniel told her everything. The unlocked gate. The photo shoot. Walt's account, unchanged in 10 years because no one had ever asked him to change it back. Thomas pulling Clara from the water, too late, and never receiving a single word of thanks for trying. The settlement. The silence bought with it. His mother's threat, delivered less than an hour ago, to end Elena's career if she pushed any further. Elena sat back down slowly, the box of photographs forgotten beside her. "He never blamed anyone," she said quietly, almost to herself. "In 10 years of marriage, he never once said a bad word about your family. I used to think it was strange. Now I understand why. He was protecting the truth, even from me. I'm sorry, Daniel said. For all of it. For everything that was taken from him. From you. Elena looked up, and there were tears in her eyes, but her voice stayed steady. I need to think. I need to figure out what's right for Mia, not just what's right for the truth. Take whatever time you need. But that night, after Daniel left, Elena didn't sleep. She sat awake with the letter Thomas had written, the one meant for a man he'd never gotten the courage to send it to, and she thought about a decade of quiet dignity that had cost her husband everything. By morning, she'd made a decision. Not the one Daniel expected. She was packing when he arrived unannounced the next afternoon, boxes half-taped, Mia's toys already bagged by the door. Elena, what are you doing? Leaving, she said, not looking up from the box in her hands. Before this becomes a war between your family and mine. Mia doesn't need that. She's 3. She needs stability, not a legal battle with a Hartley. You don't have to run. I'm not running from you, Elena said, finally meeting his eyes. I'm running from what happens next. Your mother threatened my career last night. What happens when Mia's older and someone tells her the truth about who gave her that rabbit? I won't raise my daughter in the middle of your family's guilt. She's part of my family's story too, Daniel said. Whether we like it or not. Elena hesitated, the tape gun frozen in her hand. That's when Mia wandered in from the bedroom, dragging a small showbox Elena hadn't seen before, one that had been tucked at the back of the closet. Mama, I found Daddy's box, she announced, setting it down proudly on the floor between the half-packed boxes. Elena frowned. That's not, I don't remember this being with our things. She opened it carefully. Inside were a few small items, a pocket knife, an old estate keychain, a folded photograph, and a small handheld recorder, the kind used years ago for voice memos, its plastic casing scratched and dulled with age. I've never seen this before, Elena whispered. Daniel crouched beside her as she pressed the small power button, unsure if a decade-old battery would even hold a charge. A faint click. Then static. Then a voice, young, unmistakably alive in a way that made both adults go still. If anyone's listening to this, it's probably because I finally worked up the courage to actually give it to someone, or because I didn't, and someone found it after I was gone. Either way, my name is Thomas Reyes. I grew up on the Hartley estate. And what happened to Clara Hartley wasn't an accident, not the way they told it. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. The recording continued, Thomas's voice steady despite the story it carried, describing the gate, the pond, Margaret's instructions to the staff, his own failed attempt to save a little girl he'd considered something like a sister. I don't hate the Hartleys. I loved that family, even after everything. I just hope someday, somehow, the truth finds its way to Daniel. He deserves to know he was never the reason. None of it was ever his fault. The recording clicked off. Daniel sat frozen on the floor of a half-packed apartment, his sister's true story finally spoken aloud in a voice from beyond the grave. He recorded this so someone would know, Elena whispered. Even if he never had the courage to send it himself. Before either of them could speak again, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Margaret stood in the hallway when Elena opened it, dressed in a tailored coat, her expression carved from ice. I heard you were leaving, Margaret said, stepping past Elena without invitation. Good. That simplifies things considerably. Mother. Daniel stood quickly. This isn't the time. There will never be a good time, Daniel, so I'm making this the time. Margaret turned to Elena, her voice clipped and precise. I'll have my lawyers draw up a generous severance package, on the condition that you and your daughter leave the state and sign an agreement never to discuss the Hartley family again, publicly or privately. You can't bribe her into silence, Daniel said. I'm not bribing anyone, Margaret said coolly. I'm offering a reasonable arrangement that protects everyone's interests, including this child's future. My daughter's future, Elena said, her voice shaking but firm, does not need to be built on your silence. Margaret's composure flickered, just slightly. You have no idea what you're asking for if you refuse. I have spent 30 years protecting this family's name. I am not going to let a maid and a recording undo that in one afternoon. Say it, Daniel said quietly. Margaret turned to him. Say what? The truth. All of it. Not just the gate. I want to know why you erased Thomas so completely there isn't a single record of him ever existing. That's not just damage control, Mother. That's something else. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Daniel had walked in, something like real fear crossed her face, not fear of scandal, not fear of the press. Fear of him specifically knowing. You should sit down, Margaret said finally, her voice unsteady in a way Daniel had never once heard in 34 years. Both of you. Because what I'm about to tell you changes more than just how Clara died. She looked at Elena, then at Mia, playing quietly with her rabbit near the window, utterly unaware that the box she'd found had just cracked open a truth 10 years buried. Thomas wasn't just some groundskeeper's son I wanted forgotten, Margaret said. He was never supposed to be raised in the staff quarters at all. Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. What are you talking about? Margaret closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength for a confession she'd carried alone for far longer than 10 years. Thomas was your father's son, she said. Before me. Before our marriage. Which makes him your brother, Daniel. Not some family friend's child who happened to grow up on our land. The room went utterly silent. Which means, Margaret continued, her voice breaking on the words, that little girl playing by the window isn't just connected to this family by an old tragedy. She looked directly at Mia. She's your niece. The words hung in the air like something none of them could take back. Daniel stared at his mother, then at Mia, who was still crouched by the window humming softly to her rabbit, utterly unaware that she had just become the center of a truth that had taken 10 years and one lost toy to surface. Say that again, Daniel said quietly. Slowly. Because I need to understand exactly what you just told me. Margaret sank into the nearest chair, the ice in her posture finally cracking under its own weight. Your father had an affair, she said. Before we married. With a young woman named Carmen. Thomas was born 9 months after it ended. When your father and I got engaged, Carmen came to him, frightened, with nowhere else to go. He didn't want a scandal. I didn't want a scandal. So we did what people like us do. You hid him, Elena said, her voice flat with disbelief. In plain sight. On your own property. We gave Carmen a position on staff, Margaret said. Gave Thomas a life. A good one, by most standards. He had a home, an education, food, safety. What he didn't have was his name. His real place in this family. We told ourselves it was kindness. It was cowardice. Daniel felt something crack open in his chest, not just grief for Clara now, but for a brother he'd never been allowed to know as one. He grew up feet from me, Daniel said. Playing with Clara. And nobody ever told me he was my brother. Your father was terrified what it would do to his marriage. To the company. To how the world saw this family. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. And when Clara died, when I made that decision about the gate, when I panicked and lied to protect myself, Thomas became inconvenient in an entirely new way. Not just an embarrassing secret. A witness. Someone who knew exactly what I'd done and had every reason to hate us for it. So you erased him, Daniel said. Completely. I paid Carmen a settlement large enough that she'd never need to work again, on the condition she disappear with her son and never speak the truth. I had every record scrubbed. I told myself it was to protect you from a scandal that would follow you your entire life. But really, Margaret's voice broke for the first time in Daniel's memory. Really, I was protecting myself from ever having to look at that boy again and remember what I'd done. Elena had gone very still, staring at the woman who had built and buried so much in the name of an image. Thomas never told me any of this, she said. Not one word. He let me believe he simply lost his father young. He carried this his entire life and never made me carry it with him. Because he was a better person than either of us, Margaret said quietly, looking at Daniel. He proved that the day he jumped into that pond to save a little girl who, by blood, was already his half-sister. He never once used that word. Not to the press, not to anyone. He simply tried to save her. Mia looked up finally, sensing the weight in the room even if she couldn't name it. She toddled over and climbed onto Elena's lap, rabbit tucked beneath her chin, watching the adults with the quiet attentiveness only small children manage in rooms too heavy for them. Daniel knelt down in front of her. "Hi again," he said softly. Mia studied him. "You're the man from the party." "I am." He smiled, though his eyes were wet. "Do you know something, Mia? Your daddy was a very brave person. Braver than almost anyone I've ever known." Mia nodded seriously, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "He's your uncle too," Elena told her gently, nodding toward Daniel. "Sort of. It's a little complicated, but his family." Mia considered this with the enormous gravity 3-year-olds reserve for very important announcements. "Okay," she said simply, and held her rabbit out toward Daniel. "You can hold buttons if you want." Daniel's composure, carefully held together through 10 minutes of devastating revelation, finally gave out. He took the worn little rabbit in both hands as though it were something sacred, and for a moment he simply couldn't speak. "Thank you," he managed. Margaret stood slowly, smoothing her coat with hands that visibly trembled now. "I know an apology changes nothing," she said. "I know money changes nothing. I have spent 10 years telling myself I did what was necessary, and I have been wrong every single day of it." "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Are you still planning to threaten me into silence?" "No." Margaret's voice was quiet, stripped of its usual polish. "I think I've done enough damage trying to control this story. I think it's time I let it be told the way it actually happened." She looked at Daniel. "I'll cooperate with whatever you decide is right. The foundation records, the insurance statements, all of it. If you want the truth made public, I won't fight you. I think, after everything, that decision should be yours and Elena's to make. Not mine." Daniel looked at Elena. "This isn't only my decision," he said. "It's yours too. Whatever you and Mia need, protection, privacy, the truth told loudly or told quietly, that comes first. Not my family's name. Not my mother's guilt." Elena was quiet for a long moment, holding her daughter, looking at the rabbit now cradled in Daniel's hands like something returned from very far away. "I don't want a scandal," she said finally. "I don't want cameras outside my daughter's window or reporters asking a 3-year-old about her dead father's secret family. But I don't want another decade of silence either. Thomas deserves better than being erased twice." "What do you want, then?" Daniel asked. "The truth told honestly," Elena said. "Just not as a headline. As a beginning." In the weeks that followed, there was no press conference, no dramatic public confession splashed across evening news. Instead, quietly and deliberately, Daniel established the Clara and Thomas Hartley Memorial Fund, dedicated to supporting families of household and hospitality staff. Scholarships, housing assistance, protections against the kind of quiet erasure that had swallowed an entire family for a decade. Thomas's name was added, finally, to the small family plot at the edge of the estate, not as a stranger but as what he'd always been. A private ceremony, just Daniel, Elena, Mia, Walt, and, standing a little apart, unsure if she'd earned the right to be there at all, Margaret. Margaret didn't try to erase her guilt with the gesture. She simply showed up, quietly, and stayed. Walt received a long overdue thank you, and an apology that arrived 10 years later than it should have, but arrived all the same. Margaret began, slowly and imperfectly, the long work of repair, with Daniel, with Walt, with a truth she could no longer control but had finally chosen to stop running from. The garden looked different in spring than Daniel remembered it from that terrible October 10 years ago. Sunlight moved through new leaves instead of storm clouds. The pond had been redesigned, no longer a hidden hazard behind a gate meant to keep secrets in, but an open, gently sloped water feature with a low fence that any child could safely be near. Mia ran across the lawn, laughing, Buttons no longer clutched defensively to her chest but tucked casually under one arm, the way a toy is carried by a child who finally feels safe enough to set it down sometimes. "Uncle Danny, watch this." Daniel looked up from the blanket where he sat with Elena, watching Mia attempt a wobbly cartwheel that ended in a graceful collapse onto the grass, followed by delighted giggling. "That was incredible," Daniel called back, laughing. Elena smiled beside him, sunlight catching the small, easier lines of her face, the ones that came from a life no longer built entirely around fear and silence. "She calls you that so naturally now," Elena said. "Uncle Danny." "I like it," Daniel admitted. "More than I expected to." Elena had started her own housekeeping and staffing agency that spring, one built around fair contracts and real protections for the people who worked in homes like the one that had once tried so hard to erase her family. The Hartley Foundation was quietly one of her first clients, not out of obligation, Daniel had insisted, but because her work was simply the best in the city. Margaret approached from the terrace, uncertain as always these days in a way that suited her better than her old composure ever had. She held a small wrapped gift, offering it to Mia with something like shyness. "For you," Margaret said. "If your mother says it's all right." Elena nodded, and Mia tore into the paper to find a small stuffed rabbit. New, soft, unworn, its ears stitched with careful, deliberate crookedness. "I had it made to match," Margaret explained quietly. "So Buttons doesn't have to be alone anymore. And so she has one that isn't so fragile to play with every day." Mia hugged the new rabbit immediately, then held both toys up triumphantly. "Two bunnies." "Two bunnies," Margaret agreed, and for the first time in longer than Daniel could remember, his mother's smile reached all the way to her eyes. That evening, after Mia had fallen asleep on the porch swing between them, Daniel looked out at the garden, the fountain still hissing softly like rain, the same sound that used to lull him to sleep as a boy, before he understood what it had also covered up. "Do you ever wonder," Elena asked quietly, "how different things would have been if that letter had reached you 10 years ago?" Daniel thought about it for a long moment. "I used to think the truth would only destroy things," he said. "I think I was wrong. It just took the right people finally choosing to stop hiding from it." Elena reached over and took his hand, and for once, neither of them needed to say anything else. The garden held its quiet. And for the first time in a decade, that quiet finally felt like peace, and not like a secret. If you've ever uncovered a truth that changed the way you saw your own family, whether it broke your heart or finally made it whole, tell us about it in the comments below. Sometimes the smallest things, a toy, a letter, a name almost forgotten, carry the biggest truths we were never meant to lose.